Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 461 for the 5th of Adar in a regular year. If you've been following along the podcast over the past few days or so, maybe even over the past week, you may have noticed that we're in a section of the Tanya that isn't the most happy-go-lucky, warm, fuzzy, feel-good feeling kind of stuff that we've been learning. By contrast, there's been a lot of rude awakenings, raw truths. The Alter Rebbe really breaking us down, making us realize who we really are, how flawed we are as human beings. And while we've talked about how, this really shouldn't get us down and how this is really there to shake us up and all of that stuff, nevertheless, this section today, this new chapter that we're going to be beginning, chapter 31 of Likkutei Amarim, this is where the Alter Rebbe actually takes the opportunity to address this point, address the fact that as we've mentioned, sadness is never a good thing. And somebody might listen to the past few days' episodes, learn the chapter from yesterday, learn the past couple of chapters, and really start to get down on themselves, really start to feel like, wow, like a real loser, like somebody look at all the sins I've did, or even if I haven't done any sins, am I really exerting it myself as much as I should? Like it can kind of feel kind of hopeless, there's this term in psychology, learned hopelessness, where you feel like no matter how much you try, no matter how much you strive, you're just never getting anywhere. You can never get out of your rut, which is kind of like what the Alter Rebbe is kind of telling us, is that you'll never be a tzaddik your whole life. Even if you struggle from today till tomorrow, you are stuck. You're still just a bag of bones. You have these desires for things that are against God, so where does that leave us? How we're on the one hand, we're learning all of that. On the other hand, we know that we're supposed to serve God with joy. This is a very big precept. The Alter Rebbe himself spoke about this. So how do we do that? What are we supposed to do with this information? So that's what the Alter Rebbe is going to be addressing today. And the angle that he's going to go about it is he's going to talk about how there are two emotions which at first glance might appear to be very similar or identical, when in fact they're very different. What are these two emotions? There's the emotion of sadness or depression, which as we've already learned is never a good thing. Remember, we had that whole episode about how sadness there's a heaviness that happens, and being heavy, if you have a fighter, he could be the best boxer in the world, but if he's feeling sad, that's going to weigh him down and he's not going to be able to fight the opponent. If we want to win the war against our Yetzer Hara, we can't be sad. We can't have this heaviness overtake us. But then there's this other emotion called bitterness. Bitterness does not have the same heaviness that sadness has. Bitterness has kind of there's a dynamism to it. There's a movement there. Like when somebody's feeling bitter, they feel like they're motivated to want to change. They're motivated to want to do something. It's kind of like an angry emotion. Like when a person's feeling bitter, they start think about the last time that you felt bitter. It feels very different than feeling despondent or depressed or sad, right? There's a movement for it. There's a motivation to do something about it. And that's what the theme of today's episode is going to be all about how it is to, now that we've, gone through this whole process, hopefully, if you've been following along the past few episodes, of really breaking yourself down and, coming into this state of brokenness, rather than just being in this broken place and being in a state of learned helplessness, to actually turn that brokenness, to take all of those sad, low feelings and channel them into a place of bitterness, channel them into anger. Like an analogy that you might think about is, let's say if you open up, we talked about, checking our bank accounts on a daily basis. So imagine you open your bank account one day and you see that it's overdrawn, God forbid, by $500. And the first thought that you have for yourself is, oh my gosh, what did I do? I bounced the check again. And, I really need to make more money or whatever. And you just start feeling really low about yourself, especially if you've been struggling financially for the past while. But then you take another look at the bank account and then you start to realize, wait a second. This was not you. This isn't that you, that you overdrew it and you're such a loser that you're not making enough money. There was fraud on your accounts, and you can identify who the fraud was, who it was that you did that. Those feelings of despondency, those feelings of kind of like helplessness at, thinking of yourself as this low loser person are going to quickly switch and transform into anger and into bitterness over who did this to you, who stole $500 from you. And you're going to channel that to go after them most likely and get your money back. So that's the same idea here. So in this case, what happens is this whole thing of this dichotomous living that we have. We have our animal soul, we have our godly soul. And so whereas first we started from the place of the animal soul, this is like our ego. This is where we kind of identify for, kind of our day-to-day living kind of thing. But when we start to realize that this identification that we have, this animal soul that we have is really flawed, and really it's really taking you away from your ultimate purpose of serving God, connecting with God. So yeah, that might make you feel low at first, but then what you need to do with that sadness, that feeling of lowness, is to then go and make it bitter and start to feel bitter towards these evil forces that are preventing your godly soul from manifesting itself. And when you feel that bitterness, then you can quickly then go, and this can motivate you to change, to do something about it. You actually can feel empowered now to change. You realize you do not have to be a slave to the animal, to these evil forces. You can take ownership. You can take agency over the situation. So that's the theme of today's episode. And so let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains this. For context, we're beginning a new chapter today, chapter 31 of Likkutei Amarim. And the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that it may come to pass that if a person really meditates and contemplates at length about all of these things that we've been discussing, meaning that we are very flawed people and not as great as we think we are and all of that stuff, this most likely will lead to a lowering of the spirit and a broken heart, as we discussed. And this may lead to a great sadness. And if this happens, then do not be concerned, the Alter Rebbe says. Because even though the sadness comes from klipas noga, as we discussed. So again, it comes from the translucent type of klipa, but it is a klipa, and it doesn't come from holiness. So it's not coming from this purely good place, because how do we know that it's not coming from holiness? Because about holiness, it says, oz v'chedva bimkomo. So that is a quote from Divrei Hayamim, chapter 16, verse 27, which literally means strength and gladness are in his place. So meaning to say that in the side of holiness, there's only gladness, only good. Sadness does not belong on the side of holiness. It's not from there. That's not the origin of where it's coming from. And there's also this idea that the Shekhinah, the divine indwelling, doesn't dwell unless in a place of happiness. So it only dwells in a place of happiness. And so too, when we talk about halacha, that there must be a certain joy. This is explained in the Gemara in Masachet Shabbos, page 30b. That you need a certain type of joy when you're studying halacha. However, there is an exception to this, and this is what the Alter Rebbe gets into here, is that if the sadness is coming from heavenly affairs, then yes, true, it is coming from klipas noga. But if you recall, within klipas noga, there was a spark of good within, and that's what made it different than the other klipos. So it's coming from the spark of good that is in this klipas noga. However, it is klipa, right? So it's not coming from kedusha. And then in brackets, the Alter Rebbe says that this is why the Arizal taught that even if a person is worried about sins, which seems to be a holy thing to do, there are specified times that we should do this. There should be during times of vidui, of confession, and not in a regular time of prayer or learning Torah, because then you should just be in a pure state of holiness and joy. But nevertheless, there is this idea that in order to fight this Sitra Achra, this other side, we need to use its own tools against it. So even though it is coming from Klipos, or rather because it's coming from Klipa, because it's coming from Klipas Noga, we specifically need to use its own tools against it. So what does this mean? So for this, the Alter Rebbe brings two citations, both from the Gemara. The first one is, and I'm not going to attempt to read the Aramaic. I know Hebrew. I don't know Aramaic very well, but the translation is, from the forest itself comes the handle for the axe. So this is from Sanhedrin 39b, and this is what I mentioned in the beginning in the intro to this podcast today about this idea of how, if you think about it, what do we use to chop down trees in the forest? We use an axe, but how do we make an axe? We make an axe out of the handle of the axe is made from a tree. So it's like we're using the tree itself against it. And then there's another quote also from the Gemara, this time from Shabbos, page 121b, where it says that he encountered one of his own kind. So it's again this idea that like it's really sometimes in order to fight an enemy, you have to use its own tools against it. And so then the Alter Rebbe brings up this idea of that, which is something which we had brought up previously. This is from Mishlei, chapter 14, verse 23, where it says, that in every sadness, there should be a profit or an advantage. So meaning to say that, remember, we spoke about this a few episodes ago, if you want to go back and listen to it, that the idea of sadness in its own right is not good. There's nothing good about sadness on its own. However, if we are able to use sadness in such a way that there is an advantage from it, there is a way to redeem it. There is something to redeem the sadness if we use it or if we channel it properly. And so now the Alter Rebbe gets a little bit into semantics here, which is really going to clarify a lot of what's going on about how, on the one hand, it seems like sadness is bad, but on the other hand, sadness over holy things seems to be kind of good. So what's happening? So the Alter Rebbe says that in truth, this idea of a broken heart and the bitterness of the soul on being far from the light of God and it being enclosed in the Sitra Achra, in the other side, are not actually called sadness at all in the Holy Tongue. Because what is sadness? What is atzvos? That's the Hebrew word for sadness, is when the person's heart is blocked like a rock and there is no life force in their heart at all. And however, bitterness and a broken heart is something totally different. It's not that the heart is blocked. It's that rather there's a lot of life and a lot of vitality in the heart in order to cause it to become bitter like that. So feeling bitter, like that embitterment kind of feeling, is actually a sign of life. It's not like real depression is like where if you ever, God forbid, encountered somebody who was depressed or felt that way, there's a lack of feeling. It's like kind of like this apathy or just no feeling, versus a sense of bitterness. There is a lot of feeling. It's just that what is the feeling? The feeling, the Alter Rebbe says, its vitality comes from the gvuras, comes from the severities, the holy severities. So give a little bit of context. We kind of brought this up before about how there's 10 energies, spiritual energies that vitalize the entire world. And so one of these is gvura. Gvura is on the left side. It's often translated as restraint or severity or whatever, and it's a very important quality that's necessary, and it isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like we might think of like strictness or severity as a bad thing, but it's not necessarily. It can be used for a good thing. So the sense of bitterness, what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us, actually is coming from a good place. It's coming from the holy gvuras, the holy severities. Versus joy, on the other hand, comes from the chasadim. That's on the right side. This is the level of the side of kindness or giving and like overflow, expansion. Because the heart is made up of both of these. So within the heart, we have both. We have the expansive part of ourselves, and then we have the more restraining part of ourselves. And sometimes we need to arouse this aspect of the gvuras, of the holy gvuras, of the holy severities, in order to sweeten the judgments, which come from the side of come from the animal soul and the Yetzer Hara and the evil inclination when they are, God forbid, in rule, like when they're starting to control the body. Because the only way we can sweeten these judgments is in their source, in their root. So so basically, so it's like, if just to kind of like visualize that, if a person's, let's say if a person's evil, we talked about this war that's constantly going on between the animal soul and the godly soul. And so then if a person's animal soul is starting to, God forbid, like kind of rule over them, so that animal soul is coming also from a more severe place. It's coming from this more harsh kind of place, but not in a holy way. And in order to break it, it needs to be uprooted from its source. So what's the source ultimately of these of the animal soul and of this kind of severe energy is in the holy severity. So it's like we want to go into the holy, the energy of the severity, and knock it into its place. So it's sort of like if you think about, let's say if you're teaching a class and there's a kid who is acting up in class. So the best thing to do is not to go up to the kid at that moment and start being nice to them and like, being kind and, oh, what is it that you want? Maybe we can talk about this and everything, even though I know that's a very popular idea nowadays, that we can kind of talk to criminals and make them feel good and listen to them and appease their demands. This is not the Torah way, and it's not really useful, and it's not something very practical. What you would do in such a situation, if a kid is acting up in class, you have to go over to them and be somewhat severe, and you need to kind of speak to them in their language and put them in their place, maybe just knock some sense into them kind of thing. And so this is kind of what we're doing here, is what we're talking about, is that in order, the purpose of these holy severities, the holy Gevuros, is in order to kind of knock sense and fight against the animal impulse that we have. And this is why the Alter Rebbe says that the sages taught that a person should always have their Yetzer Tov, their good inclination. It should be angry against the negative inclination. And a person can do this at any time. This is something that anybody can do at any time, is they can arouse their good inclination against their evil inclination and make it angry and bring up this anger against it. However, the most opportune time for most people, the Alter Rebbe teaches, is when a person is feeling sad in any event. So if a person happens to be feeling sad, whether it's about worldly affairs or just for no reason at all. If a person, we have different moods. Sometimes we wake up and we're not in the best mood and we're just feeling sad for no reason. So the Alter Rebbe is teaching us, take advantage of that sadness. Don't let it go to waste. So if you are feeling sad, this is actually a very opportune time for you to transform this sadness in order to bitterness, and to feel bitter about your life and about how far you are from God, and to come into this state of doing a self-accounting, so to speak. And this is a very opportune time to fulfill this idea of having your Yetzer Tov, your good inclination, get angry about your evil inclination. And through this, the Alter Rebbe says, this actually is going to help you eradicate the sadness over your worldly affairs. So there's sort of two things going on. So the Alter Rebbe is teaching us that, first of all, if a person is feeling sad, this is an opportunity. So he's sort of flipping it on its head. He's saying that that sadness could actually have a positive element to it. We've thought about how sadness isn't really positive and it doesn't really have anything good about it. But the Alter Rebbe is saying it could be positive because we can use it as a tool. And if a person is feeling sad, this is a very opportune and auspicious time to take that sadness and turn it into bitterness, and turn it into this opportunity for self-reflection and self-growth that isn't always available to us in a regular manner. And now the second thing the Alter Rebbe is teaching us is not only is it just an opportune time to do this, but it actually, through doing this, through taking your sadness and transforming it into bitterness, this will actually eradicate the sadness.
And then tomorrow we will move on and we'll find out how this process can actually transform the sadness into joy. So stay tuned for that, and we will continue with this chapter tomorrow. I'll speak to you then.
Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.